Hello, everyone. It's me back again, and I've got a little bit of a different thing served up for you today than my usual programming. Today, I'm going to be going over a list of 85 albums that have really influenced me personally, and are albums that I keep coming back to year after year and finding new and interesting things to enjoy about them. In terms of the 85 number, well, that's just what I was able to dredge out of my memory and my research. And it's a nice round number. It works. And these are albums again that I really enjoy and that have really shaped my own life as a music fan and really helped me to develop the kinds of things that I'm interested in and really sort of acted as signposts or guideposts along the way towards getting into new genres. So this is going to be quite a diverse list, but there are some qualifications for which albums were able to get onto this list. First off, the only albums that I included were albums that I could definitively say that I liked at least half the songs. So there are definitely some albums that almost made the cut, but not quite. The other restriction is that I didn't want to include any albums that I first got into in 2021 or 2022, as this would sort of defeat the purpose of it being like albums that were incredibly influential on me, in terms of discovering new stuff. Whether that be albums from those years per se, or albums from earlier years that I just happened to first hear in 2021 or 2022. And finally, this is not some attempt to create some sort of objective list of the quote unquote greatest albums of all time according to some kind of objective criteria like popularity or influence or experimentation, not some Rolling Stone magazine type thing or anything like that. The albums here are not ranked in order of preference or ranked in any way. They are solely done in chronological order by month and year of release. And with that said, let's get into it.
I've never been in love before. No.
Starting off strong with the only 50s album, and one of only three jazz albums on my list, I'm not really a jazz guy, but I was struck by this album because it was a vocally oriented album, and I didn't have to listen to no one singing for 45 minutes, and I fell in love straight away. He's very sensitive and incredibly self effacing, and he sings like it could fall apart at any moment, but it just works and flows effortlessly with beautiful and poignant vocal melodies.
I've really never been in love before.
His voice may be flawed, and as a result of this, most of the best renditions of his songs are performed by other people, but any folk fan of any age must come to reckon with Dylan eventually. Although I haven't listened to the whole album, fantastic tracks like the calming Don't Think Twice It's Alright and the lyrical triumph of A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall have earned their place in my memory forever.
You just kinda wasted my precious time. But don't think twice, it's alright. Olha que coisa mais.
The second jazz album on my list, and one I only uncovered in about 2019 or so, this is the definitive bossa nova record. packed with hits from start to finish, from the inimitable girl from Ipanema to the slightly less famous but still highly lauded Para Me Sucar Meu Coração and Desafinado, and the highly underrated So Danço Samba. João Gilberto's smooth guitar playing and even smoother main vocals are let down a bit by Astrid Gilberto's off-key secondary vocals, but it's still an enjoyable listen.
Porque tudo é tão triste. Running from home.
Bert Jansch, self-titled, April 1965. Bert Jansch is an incredibly underrated artist from the English folk revival of the mid to late 60s, a musical movement that is often overshadowed by the more popular and prominent Irish and American folk revivals of the same period. While I haven't listened to the whole album, the simple tunes, evocative of similar themes of 19th or 18th century British working class life alongside most of the other artists of that period, well, those that actually cared about history and authenticity at least, have stayed with me for a while, and it's a record I often turn back to when I feel trapped and stuck in my humdrum everyday life. And it includes Angie as the closing track, one of the most beautiful instrumental folk pieces ever written.
Oh, the time will come up when the wind will stop.
Peter, Paul and Mary, tonight in person on the BBC, October 1965. The first and only album on my list that's not actually an album, this is a television special of a concert recorded in England. For those unfamiliar, Peter, Paul and Mary were a group that perfectly encapsulated a mix of inspiring, calming and melodic folk in the American style. Their rendition of the traditional hobo tune 500 Miles is one of my favorite songs, although it's not on here. Some of the tracks from this program I've been playing forever, and some I've only discovered a few years ago, but the whole thing is worth a listen.
And the seagulls, they'll be smiling.
Jackson C. Frank, self-titled, December 1965. Poignant, dark, and mysterious, with a piercing, just slightly operatic voice, this Buffalo, New York-born 60s singer-songwriter is definitely the most obscure of those I've decided to feature today, but there's still enough in his catalog that you shouldn't let him slip past you. Bert Jansch loved him, and so did a couple other important artists in my life that I'll be covering soon. From the simple and mild-mannered blues run the game, to the intense, fierce, and almost medieval Milk and Honey, my personal favorite, Jackson's stuff can certainly get anyone to stop and listen for a while.
Love's eyes.
Simon and Garfunkel, Sound of Silence, January 1966. Simon and Garfunkel's 5-album catalog has so many great songs spread so widely throughout it, so it was really hard to pick any of them at all that fit my criteria of appreciating at least half on a single album. Though I nearly included their 3rd album alongside this one, which includes For Emily, one of my favorite songs, as well as The Dangling Conversation, this one is just a little better. It has, of course, the quite overplayed title track. It has I Am a Rock. It has a rather underwhelming version of Bert Jansch's Angie, the 2 underrated minstrel ballads that are Leaves That Are Green and April Come She Will, and of course, Kathy's Song, one of the simplest, most well-written love songs that there is. Just listen.
And as I watch the drops of rain weave their weary paths and I know that I am like the rain
The Beatles, Revolver, August 1966. While the Beatles really had no bad records, well, unless you count the Yellow Submarine soundtrack, Revolver and another one that's coming up later are just a cut above the rest. Here, There, and Everywhere spent a fairly sizable chunk of time at the top of my list of favorite Beatles songs. I mean, just listen. Paul's calming, almost lullaby-like vocals are exactly what that melody ordered.
Both of us thinking how good it can be. Someone is speaking, but she doesn't know he's there.
She Said is also near the top of my list, and really makes clear what good psychedelic rock should be. The mixture of bluesy, aggressive, crunchy guitar licks with powerful, ethereal, pseudo-operatic vocals. Well, maybe John didn't have that last part down, but it's still solid work. Dr. Robert and Your Bird Can Sing and Got to Get You Into My Life are great upbeat rock tunes, and I'm Only Sleeping is a great, more soulful track that's often overlooked.
Jack Ryan was as good a fiddler.
Bert Jansch, Jack Orion, September 1966. With this, his third release, Bert Jansch would up the ante significantly, delving into territory that was wilder, more frantic, almost proggy in its ambition, such as the title track. This album is also notable for Black Waterside, an interpretation of a piece written by Anne Briggs a few years earlier, and an interpretation which Jimmy Page would proceed to riff up wholesale for his experimental folk track Black Mountainside on Led Zeppelin's third album. The highlight of this album, however, would definitely be Nottingham Town, with traditional lyrics painting a very emotional and evocative picture.
Came a stark and naked drummer, oh, a beating is a drum. With his hands on his bosom, came a marching along.
You know the day destroys the night, night divides the day.
The Doors, self-titled, January 1967. I don't think a lot of people fully appreciate just how consistent the Doors catalog actually was. To have 6 releases in 4 years is impressive enough, but to have 4 of those releases actually be good is rarer still. While Waiting for the Sun, Strange Days, and LA Woman all have lots of great tracks, there's just something special about this album. I've noticed that the Doors are one of those bands that people tend to be more attracted to when they first discover rock music, and they've definitely faded from my awareness more and more as I get older, but I still appreciate them for what they are. A band with one of the greatest vocalists in rock music, one of the most interesting keyboard tones, and above all, a band dedicated to ambiance. The ambiance of a hot summer night in America, filled with all sorts of transgressive, individualist, countercultural people with a dark, violent edge, yet still ultimately good. The closing track, The End, still fires my imagination like no other. Warrior poets doing all sorts of masculine transgressive things, black magicians, vampires, raw sexual energy, on the prowl living outside of society, a dreamscape of ultimate freedom. Really proto-goth stuff in a way.
Come on, baby, take a chance with us and meet me at the back of the blue bus tonight. Blue rock on the blue bus tonight. Ooh,
Jefferson Airplane, Surrealistic Pillow, February 1967. It's unfortunate how many people simply look at the psychedelic rock movement from vaguely 1967 to 1971 as just a representation of the social and political context of the time, and not as actual serious music in its own right. In terms of psychedelic rock as a whole, the Airplane definitely deserve their fame and renown, although I think it's criminal that so few people dig any farther beyond this one San Francisco band. While they have many great tracks scattered throughout various decent albums, Surrealistic Pillow is definitely their most consistent. Sure, the two most popular songs on the album, and the most popular songs by the Airplane in general, White Rabbit and Somebody to Love, aren't bad by any means, but hopefully a careful listen or two to Comin' Back to Me, or Today, two plaintive, introspective, even perhaps pseudo-medieval love songs on side A, will be enough to convince naysayers that only really know Grace Slick's songs that Marty Balin is a great vocalist in his own right, something that can be seen even more if you venture beyond this offering to their later records, like Crown of Creation, Bark, and my personal favorite after this one, Volunteers.
The summer had inhaled and held its breath too long. The winter looked the same as if it never had gone. And through an open window where no curtain hung,
The Velvet Underground. The Velvet Underground in Nico, March 1967. Sure, it's pioneering, simultaneously heralding the later predominance of alternative rock, progressive rock, and punk all at the same time. And sure, the vocal performances by frontman Lou Reed and German model Nico, real name Christina Pefkin, aren't anything award-winning, but I'm still flabbergasted by how easily people will let their opinions of just Nico and Lou form their perspective on the band as a whole. And how few people really get just how talented of guitarists John Cale and Sterling Morrison are. The guitars are just so thick and crunchy and nasty. It's incredible, there's really nothing like it. This album is at its peak when both of them are just let loose to show off just how good they are with composing wild, chaotic, rollicking, clanging guitar pieces, like the second track, I'm Waiting for the Man, which really makes you snap out of your reverie and get up and dance. There She Goes Again, which is a little slower, but still similar, and especially my favorite song on the album, Run, Run, Run. Man, that intro, it just crackles and bursts into life. It's really what rock and roll is all about. The songs on the album seem to come in groups of 2 or 3. There's Femme Fatale and I'll Be Your Mirror, probably the 2 most stylistically similar songs on the whole album, which are both quiet ballads that prominently feature Nico on vocals, and All Tomorrow's Parties and Venus in Furs are both droning, almost percussive types of songs that almost sound medieval in their atmosphere, with the former featuring Nico and the latter featuring Lou Reed's vocals turned haunting and menacing, in his best vocal performance by far, recounting a fascinating, lurid, and detailed tale of a dominatrix and her submissive taken directly from the pages of a 19th century German novella of the same name. And I can't end this without touching on Sunday Morning, my second favorite track, and one of the most romantic songs I've ever heard. Lou really puts a lot more effort into matching the mood with a calming, breathy vocal style, and man, oh man, that guitar solo. There's nothing more I can say. If you don't like this album, I don't know if we can be friends. It's just that good. The Byrds. The Byrds' Greatest Hits, Volume 1, August 1967. Many people forget about this Los Angeles band when speaking of the great musical acts of the 60s, but personally I think the soft, vulnerable, and down-to-earth personality of their music makes them incredibly unique, and so worth talking about. The Byrds weren't really an album group. I think even die-hard fans would probably agree, so that's why they'll get a spot as one of my few compilation album selections in this video. I'll admit this is one of the few selections in this video where I haven't listened to every single song, but I'll Feel a Whole Lot Better is a great upbeat pop rock tune, and 8 Miles High with its otherworldly lightning-in-a-bottle harmonies has always been one of my favorite tracks of all time. It's those unique one-in-a-million harmonies on many songs that probably will never be recaptured again that make the Byrds special for me. That and the iconic, peaceful, light jangling sound of the Rickenbacker 12th string, an instrument that will also be relevant to talk about for two other bands on this list that will come later.
Waters fly like bullets stream, drums and cannons laugh aloud. Whistles come from ashen shrouds, leaders down the world and roar.
If you hadn't heard of Old Tim before, he's the father of Jeff Buckley, and one of the most unique folk artists of all time, who took just as much influence from genres like classical and jazz. It's probably important to note that a lot of the songs on this album have better versions of them recorded in other places. For example, I'm making use of a recording from an old CBS show to showcase the opening track, instead of showing you the studio version. I would also recommend giving a listen to his Live at the Folklore Center in NYC album as well. But this is still an impressive set of tracks from one of the most unique vocalists of the era, a beautiful mixture of operatic sensibilities and pop music soul. The title track is a wonderful, vivid, dreamlike piece of poetry, romantic in the 19th century sense, and one of my favorite songs of all time. Phantasmagoria in 2 is a simple, mournful folk tune that will stick in your head a good while, and in comparison, the atmosphere on I Never Asked to Be Your Mountain is grand and majestic, with thunderingly fast acoustic guitar and booming vocals. I must also mention Pleasant Street, an undeniably freaky and bizarre cut with some very interesting lyrics. Tim Buckley really does embody the word haunting, a word I would reasonably use to describe a lot of my personal music tastes. Very much indeed.
And smile hello to the air.
H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft 1, October 1967. H.P. Lovecraft was a 5-piece psychedelic group from Chicago that only released 2 main albums in their short career. They took their name from the famous horror author, so they had some pretty big shoes to fill in terms of living up to the mystery, magic, and eerie, haunting atmosphere of their namesake. And I think they not only succeeded, but far exceeded expectations to become, in my opinion, one of the best bands of all time. It's truly sad how the only people that know about them are dyed-in-the-wool psychedelic fans like myself, dedicated to uncovering forgotten gems of the era. I do prefer their second album, and indeed I hadn't actually listened to all the tracks on this album front to back until I started preparing for this video, but I still think this debut is worth checking out. The bread and butter of this group is the haunting, powerful dueling harmonies of George Edwards and Dave Michaels, which reach their apex of creativity on the record's most popular track, The White Ship, about the mysterious ghost ship featured in the H.P. Lovecraft short story of the same name. That third verse is something else, and well, you'll just have to listen to it to really get it. I have to admit I don't particularly care for the odd country folk kick that the band members were apparently on at this point, in terms of the majority of the album being covers of that sort, but the funky atmosphere that they bring to these tracks that I wouldn't normally listen to is still very much worth hearing and much appreciated. Just wait till I get to their second album, though.
You're all that I adore.
Cream, Disraeli Gears, November 1967. Consistently tremendous. Eric Clapton and Ginger Baker are among the best of all time in their respective instrument, here in their prime. And while Jack Bruce's vocals, on the other hand, aren't world-class per se, they're certainly still underrated. We've got the great rhythm section's performance on Sunshine of Your Love and Tales of Brave Ulysses. Then we've got probably Cream's best example of one of their softer songs with Dance the Night Away. It honestly might be my favorite song on the album, along with We're Going Wrong, with its grand, wailing vocal performance. SWALBR, of course, the song with the lyrics that most openly reference psychedelics, and finally the criminally underrated Take It Back, just crackling with bluesy energy and ferocity from top to bottom. Disraeli Gears is not only a seminal record in the history of psychedelic rock, and probably the best blues rock album of all time, but the best blues album of all time, period, and a must-listen if you want to understand any of those genres, or just rock in general. The Velvet Underground, White Light, White Heat, January 1968. This second offering by the band is another wonderful slab of heavy rock with a very different feel. It's a shame how much the Velvet Underground fell off the wagon after their third album, the self-titled, which happens to have one of my favorite songs of all time on it in What Goes On. Their fourth album was hit and miss, with only 3 good tracks, although those 3 are genuinely very good, and as for the 5th release, well, yeah. Anyway, we're not here to talk about the other albums, we're here to talk about their second release. I don't listen to White Light, White Heat that much, but it always brings a little smile to my face and lights up a little part of the back of my brain whenever I see it pop up in an article or YouTube video. This one is much more experimental, with the deceptively normal and catchy, distorted ragtime rockabilly vibes of the first track lulling you into a false sense of security before the real shit begins. Oddball hipster spoken word mixed with strange, unpredictable fuzzy guitar lines. The last 2 songs really sum up what most of the album is about, especially the very last track, Sister Ray, a 17-minute-long slab of distorted, cacophonous noise rock, and also probably the only song about a blowjob I'll reference in this video.
I said I couldn't hit it sideways. I said I couldn't hit it sideways.
On this street where time has died, the golden treat you never tried. In times of old, in days gone by, if I could catch a dancing eye.
Cream, Wheels of Fire, June 1968. Critics normally go back and forth between whether this or their debut should be placed in the number 2 spot in terms of quality of releases after Disraeli Gears, with a slight majority normally going for this, their third release overall out of 4. With mysterious graphics on the front cover in the same hazy, cluttered psychedelic style as Disraeli Gears, except in white this time, you can probably expect a wild ride musically speaking. And a wild ride is what you're gonna get. The first half is probably my favorite, with a wide range of musical stylings, like a beautiful vocal performance by Jack Bruce on Those Were the Days, no relation to the Mary Hopkins song of the same name, White Room, which sounds way better live, and probably my favorite song on the album, Deserted Cities of the Heart, where nervous, frenetic guitar playing matches excellently to the abstract metaphysical lyrics and great vocals to create quite the interesting concoction. The second half, on the other hand, is a recording from a live show at the storied Fillmore Auditorium in San Francisco, inexplicably done during the recording of this album by bringing studio recording equipment to the venue. And surprisingly, it works out great. We've got what many would consider the definitive version of one of the best old school blues standards of all time by Robert Johnson, Crossroads, and a great extended jam version of a Willie Dixon song that they covered masterfully on their 1966 debut. Cool stuff all around. H.P. Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft 2, September 1968. Now this is what I'm talking about. I think I originally found H.P. Lovecraft through a music ranking list website for psychedelic albums, and this was the album of theirs that list showcased. I was blown away. I think Mobius Trip was the first song of theirs that I listened to, and I mean, these vocals are just, love 'em or hate 'em, the most unique you could find. I honestly think this band should be up there with all the grand, experimental, pretentious, alternative, and progressive bands popular on places like 4chan's Mew and RateYourMusic.com, except this band is 10 times more accessible than a lot of that stuff. After that, I listened to At the Mountains of Madness, a song inspired by the H.P. Lovecraft short story of the same name, and a powerful track, with the band's drummer Michael Texa delivering his best performance of the album. Grand, haunting, ferocious. All these words I could use to describe the vocal performances on that track as well. High Flying Bird, another one of the band's country folk covers, has some wonderful, energetic vocal performances as the song goes on. Spin, Spin, Spin on the first side, a warm, sensual, alluring love song that really evokes the feeling of a peaceful evening, and of course my favorite song on the album, Electrolintando, which you're just gonna have to hear for yourself. Although I would recommend lying down in the dark before you do. The Beatles, The White Album, November 1968. As I said, it took me a while to narrow down my favorite Beatles albums because I think that their earlier stuff is just as good as their later stuff, but eventually I settled on Revolver and, of course, this album. The White Album is fascinating. It's the most meandering, winding, strange melange of musical influences. You've got 50s rockabilly throwback on Back in the USSR, straightforward by the numbers blues on Why Don't We Do It in the Road, peaceful optimistic folk on Mother Nature's Son. It just goes on and on. When you're listening to it as the sun is going down, especially if you're in a weird emotional mood, it just creates this weird dreamlike atmosphere, like you're traveling through different dimensions on a slow, relaxing carnival ride that's maybe a little scary and off the wall, and I'm not just talking about Revolution 9. Standout tracks to me would be Rocky Raccoon, with a very underrated vocal performance by Paul, Just a lot of breath control, very well executed. Then there's Cry Baby Cry, another super underrated track with a great melody, and Helter Skelter, the first heavy metal song in history. And I'm not even getting into the more famous and talked about tracks on the first side. Truly an experience, and one I think everyone should have at least once in their life.
In the days of my youth, I was told what it means to be a man.
Led Zeppelin 1, January 1969. Sure, there is one album of theirs I prefer the most, and that comes later, but this does slide into my number 2 spot, out of the 6 of 8 good Led Zeppelin albums they released in their short career. Here we see a great offering of slightly more traditional blues rock compared to their more inventive stuff they would dream up later. The opening track, Good Times Bad Times, is a great, fun, upbeat hard rock track, and Communication Breakdown is continuously energizing and exciting to listen to this day. But the standout track in one of my favorite Zeppelin songs is definitely Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You. Originally written as an eerie banjo folk tune in the late 1950s in Appalachian style, even though the singer was actually from California, Led Zeppelin transformed it into a mournful Spanish guitar piece, given extra energy and intensity by the addition of John Bonham and his hard rock drumming skills, and even occasional gritty electric guitar interludes as well. How Many More Times and You Shook Me are pretty decent, especially in live recordings of the era. If I had to point out faults though, I think Black Mountainside is a pretty muddy and fragmented, half-hearted attempt to emulate the original Burt Jansch song, Black Waterside. But that's just probably the folk music snob in me coming out. Nick Drake, 5 Leaves Left, July 1969. Those in the know will certainly have at least heard of Old Saint Nick before, if not heard a few of his songs, but if you're unfamiliar, Nick Drake was an English folk artist in the modern style, active between 1969 and 1972, up until his untimely death at the age of 26. I think mostly as a result of this, he's often unfairly boxed in as only a writer of hauntingly depressive melodies. But honestly, that's a pretty skewed view, both in terms of underplaying the complexity of his guitar playing, and also just that most of his songs really aren't that depressing, plain as that. Out of the 2 of his 3 albums that I've chosen to feature here, this is the more depressing of the 2 to be sure, but again, there's a lot more here than meets the eye. Starting off with the opening track, Time Has Told Me, we see a musical direction that's very dependent on the backing band, in this case piano, double bass, and acoustic guitar, and a reflective and calm atmosphere that really reminds me more of country soft rock rather than folk. And some of the sadder jazz chords that are interspersed throughout the song don't really work too well as part of the vocal aspect, rather than just as an instrumental thing. But then we've got Riverman. Wow, what an amazing 4.5 minutes. It's weird to say that Nick Drake has better vocal performances than others, seeing as he pretty much sticks to the exact same soft, whispery voice in all his songs, but for some reason he just seems on top of his game here, vocals-wise. You've gotten the point of the entire vocal melody by the time the first minute is up, it just repeats, but just the aching, honeyed smoothness of that melody will stick in your brain for the rest of your life. Just like with the last track, I think the backing band kind of sours the whole thing, especially in that first minute. But the string parts that we hear when Nick isn't singing are not bad, but not great. 3 Hours is another great one, however. More dramatic and cinematic, but not melodramatic. I think it's about someone planning a murder? No clue. Don't really need to know, to be honest. It's still great. Way to Blue ain't bad, and Shallow Song is a pretty interesting experiment with a cool part in the middle where he's humming alongside the cello line, accentuating this nice mysterious melody. Thoughts of Mary Jane is a nice, cutesy, sugary track that no one can really dislike. If you don't mind some country folk like the band, and can handle just a teensy sprinkling of jazz piano, you won't find much to dislike on this record, truly. I don't really mess around with the last 3 songs that much, but I did listen to them all again while writing this, and I mean, Men in the Shed is good at least. It has a similar dramatic opening acoustic riff to 3 Hours. I think Day Is Done jostles with Riverman for my favorite song on this record, though. That opening guitar line was one of the first few things I unsuccessfully tried to learn on guitar, and the entire opening section just really is art. With the backing band never seeming out of place and the string sections coming in and out and trying new melodies throughout the piece that fit much better into the mood of the song than any other track. Led Zeppelin, Led Zeppelin 2, October 1969. Alright, on to number 2. Strap in for another wild collage of music styles from each track. There are tracks here that have never really grabbed my attention and, don't really hit me with that wave of intense nostalgia that I get tuning into a good Led Zeppelin album. But I mean, when even one of the songs that the band dislike the most, Living Loving Maid, is still deeply loved by the fans, you know you've put out quite a great release indeed. And I mean, I can understand where the band is coming from. Those lyrics are pretty cheesy. Whole Lotta Love is one of the most popular songs the band ever wrote, and I do think it's a little overrated, but I still get excited whenever I hear it come on in Walgreens. The intro still slaps. But come on, we've got the Lemon Song, great classic blues, fun on a warm summer's day, Ramble On, among the best of the band's mandolin-infused tracks, and a treat for Tolkien fans, Heartbreaker, of course, with a fun melody and that fancy guitar solo. The album's 4th track, Thank You, has always been one of my least favorite Led Zeppelin songs, probably because of the lackluster vocal performance from Robert Plant that tried really hard to be heartfelt and emotional and inflamed with passion, but just ended up sounding awkward and out of practice, at least to me. It's still good though, which is really a testament to the band. It's a great record, but I think the main reason why it stuck out to me the least compared to the other 5 great Zeppelin records is because a lot of the tracks here sound best in live recordings, where the band could be a lot more experimental. Not only with wacky jam band improv melodies, but even interspersing totally new cover songs that they never released on a studio album. I speak specifically of Earl's Court 1975, which included a lot of songs from this 1969 album, and especially Royal Albert Hall 1970, one of the best live recordings ever made, in my opinion.
It was early, early, all in the spring. The birds did whistle and sweetly sing, changing their notes from tree to tree. And
The Clancy Brothers and Tommy Macon. 150 songs, jigs, reels, and ballads of Ireland, recorded sometime in 1970. Well, I wasn't necessarily unfamiliar with Irish music before discovering this album around the age of 12, and that included traditional songs as well as modern compositions. This album really set me on the path to discovering Irish music and folk music in general. Irish folk music is still my favorite genre of folk music, and it's thanks to these guys and their still probably unmatched vocal talent. Although Andy Irvine comes close sometimes. I often think that people overrate female Irish singers in comparison to the great male ones. I discovered this album completely on accident while rummaging through my parents' cassette collection, which I think this is the only album in this video that I discovered on cassette. And we didn't actually have all the cassettes, all 150 songs, so that's important to know if you're going to try to look this up. I haven't actually listened to any recordings on this project after the first 28 songs that were actually performed by the Clancy brothers as opposed to the other songs which were performed by other artists. So that would be both sides of the first cassette only, or the first vinyl record if you're going that route. Also, I would say that the best way to hear this set of 28 songs is just to find a bunch of YouTube recordings of each individual song, as recorded by the Clancy Brothers and Tommy Makem, and just make a YouTube playlist since there aren't any full one video copies of this album on YouTube. And if you really like physical media, well, this isn't that hard to get a hold of, but it is compared to 99% of the records in this video, to be sure. Anyway, this album is filled with mostly quite old songs from a group of guys born in the 1920s and 30s in rural Tipperary, who would have learned them from their parents, who would have learned them from their parents. So the entire thing, it has again 28 songs, some of which are surprisingly long and some of which are incredibly short, paints a very vivid picture of rural Ireland, mostly in vaguely the late 1700s and early 1800s. Songs mostly about drinking and the famous failed 1798 nationalist rebellion, with a few IRA songs from the early 20th century thrown in for good measure, with just charming lyrics, wonderful melodies, and a rollicking, hearty energy that breaks some of the unfortunate American stereotypes of Celtic music being inherently ethereal and relaxing in character. Some standout tracks to me are the rousing war tunes Rising of the Moon and Roddy McCorley, which will be familiar to those already well versed in historical Irish ballads, but I mean if you haven't heard those songs before, there's no better place to hear them. Another standout is Castle of Dromore, which has a very intense poetic force that no other track here really has. I remember listening to this like day after day to help me focus on my homework, and then playing some of the songs that I found on YouTube to my special education teacher and annoying the hell out of him. And the Clancy brothers' massive catalog of records in over 50 years, both with and without Tommy Makem, they just introduced me to so many great Irish songs, which helped broaden my knowledge of so many other Irish artists. There's more than just Enya out there, people.
In heaven for grace doth sue, sing her shaboy lula lula.
Mountain, Climbing, March 1970. Another fairly forgotten artist in the vein of Tim Buckley or H.P. Lovecraft, Mountain are definitely more standard rock than either of those two, but they're still great. If you know them at all, you might know them from the closest thing they've had to a hit, and the opening track to this record, Mississippi Queen. But I think that song is super overrated. If you want that same rock energy, you're gonna get it much better on Silver Paper and Sittin' on a Rainbow, the fourth and eighth tracks respectively. Just bursting with energy, pure joy, just art. Great art and great rock and roll. There's a surprising number of great vocal performances. I particularly love For Yasker's Farm, which is the only instance of a song on an album in this video that specifically mentions Woodstock, which is pretty surprising, honestly. And Theme for an Imaginary Western, originally written by Jack Bruce of Cream. And finally, there's To My Friend, an interesting experiment in pseudo-Indian Celtic acoustic stuff.
And he's not alone.
Black Sabbath, Paranoid, September 1970. Sure, their debut album is great, who doesn't like the title track, and NIB is killer, especially the version from the Paris 1970 concert, but there's a reason their second album normally takes the top place among most fans and reviewers. The debut just isn't as consistent. But Paranoid, every single song is a banger. You got the title track, energizing, poignant, boisterous, amazing. You got Iron Man, overrated, but still, I respect the popularity, and the original music video is cool. Planet Caravan, so relaxing, so metaphysical and spacey. Some people think Fairies Wear Boots is one of the greatest drum performances ever recorded. I don't know if I believe that, I'll leave that up to you to decide, but undeniably, this just might be the most consistent album of this entire video. Led Zeppelin, Led Zeppelin 3, October 1970. This album really divided critics and fans on its release. I think mostly because of the much wider influences, mostly from different strands of folk. Friends and That's the Way are juxtaposed nicely against one another, the former a tad dark, the latter all sweetness and light, both interesting explorations of folk styles. Immigrant Song still sounds remarkably fresh and energetic, and will still transport you to a cold winter morning in the North Atlantic on a wooden Viking ship, plowing the Black Ocean in search of monasteries to raid. Celebration Day is an underrated fun track that's uplifting when you really have something to celebrate, and Tangerine is one part folk and one part pop with tremendous guitar lines, both acoustic and electric, although the vocal harmony parts in the chorus leave something to be desired. Gallows Pole is an intense folk journey with great drum parts, and Brony Hour Stomp, I dare you not to tap your foot at that. Come on. Since I've Been Loving You is also very highly regarded, a slow and damn near despondent blues rock jam that's an uncharacteristic length for Led Zeppelin at this part of their history of 7.5 minutes, only beat out by How Many More Times on the first album. It's full of longing and just blues, and I highly recommend the version from their famous concert film The Song Remains the Same. Even Hats Off to Roy Harper, one of the least popular Led Zeppelin songs, is still very good. Black Sabbath, Master of Reality, July 1971. Not much to say here. This is probably one of the albums on this list I put on the most seldom, but I do think it's a must-listen, if only for the massive influence it had on the particular subgenre of metal music known as doom metal, with the particular fuzzy, grimy guitar tones and low tunings fans of the subgenre have come to know and love. Sweet Leaf, with its instantly recognizable riff, has often been seen as inaugurating the entire project of stoner metal, with the mixture of the lyrical themes and the musical characteristics that I just elaborated on. After Forever is a faster rollicking track, Lord of this World has a great riff and bridge. Solitude, man, this is like some real, authentic, peaceful, groovy psychedelia. Children of the Grave is classic. Into the Void probably takes the cake for the best vocal melodies on the album. This is the Riff Land. Riffy goodness brought to you by the riff masters of Black Sabbath. Master of Reality truly is an integral part of one of the best 4-album runs in history. The Who is next, August 1971. Ah, The Who. How I've neglected you in the past 8 or 9 years. There was once a time when I dreamed of having Roger Daltrey's outfit in the 1978 Shepperton Studios concert film and wailing my lungs out on stage just like him. You were the soundtrack to my middle school days, just as much as some of the other artists on this list with 2 or more albums featured, but I barely even give you the time of day anymore. The Who have had one of the most interesting trajectories of all the major bands of the era that have lasted longer than 10 years, having a lot of great songs in their more poppy era prior to their 1969 concept album Tommy, and then heading into a fairly strange but not altogether horrible 80s synthesizer era. But it's the 70s, the time in between, which most fans find the most interesting. Sure, there are some rather forgettable ballads in the middle of this record, like The Song Is Over and Getting in Tune, but most of it is good, like Baba O'Reilly, which, while not being particularly musically groundbreaking, is at least a great lyrical statement. The underrated fun rocker Bargain, the inspiring paean to freedom and Going Mobile, and from top to bottom, one of my favorite songs of all time, lyrically, in terms of the energy, the riffs, you know it, it's gotta be Won't Get Fooled Again. Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin 4, November 1971. I'm still in awe of how many musical influences come together on this record. It's fitting that we start off with very by-the-numbers hard rock with Black Dog and rock and roll, because then, all of a sudden, we get Battle of Evermore, where the hypnotic mandolin riffs at the beginning just rivet you in place and let you know that you're about to go on a mystical journey that you won't forget, and will keep you firmly in its own world and won't let you go until it's finished. I highly recommend everyone look more into Sandy Denny, the backing vocalist on Evermore, her solo stuff as well as her stuff with her band Fairport Convention, especially if you like more traditional music. I'm not at all ashamed to say that Stairway to Heaven is my favorite Led Zeppelin song. It's just the perfect mix of accessible and experimental, both in its softer and rockier parts, with that guitar solo just really encapsulating the deep emotional range of this track. And come on, recorders? Who would have ever expected the recorder to sound not only good, but great? Also, has anyone that's checked out the so-called satanic backwards message in one of the verses actually listened to the whole song backwards? It's surprisingly great. Even Four Sticks, the closest this record gets to forgettable, is still pretty great, what with drummer John Bonham making use of 2 sets of drumsticks on one song, only let down by the lackluster vocals. Misty Mountain Hop is fun, relaxing, and just makes you want to sit in a park with your friends. Going to California is a wonderful acoustic meditation on love and life. And When the Levee Breaks, a cover of a country blues song about the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, still gets to me. The riffs are great, it's apocalyptic, it's frightening. I've never heard someone hit the drums so forcefully before. And there's just nothing like that first bridge around 2 minutes and 30 seconds in. Nick Drake, Pink Moon, February 1972. When most people say they're Nick Drake fans and they're only casually interested in folk music, this is normally the album they're talking about. It encapsulates the feel of who Nick Drake was in the popular imagination. Soft, gentle, acoustic, pseudo-medieval ballads, and it also has the added mystique of being released right before his death, and it's far and away the most popular of his 3 releases, and for good reason, and it's my favorite as well. At only 28 minutes, it might be the shortest album on my list, but it packs in so much. The intro to Place to Be and Which Will, the second and fourth tracks, are one of the most joyful, beautiful things I've ever heard. The way he firmly picks those higher notes on Which Will is genius. The title track is very accessible and simple, and the way he just growls out those very low vocal notes is very unexpected and unique and works better than you think it would. From the Morning is a great statement that really lives up to its lyrics. I think maybe more than any other track, it's a celebration of nature, unadorned, with little melodramatic pretension or poetic artifice to distract you from enjoying the atmosphere. Parasite and Things Behind the Sun might be the closest thing this album has to actually depressing tracks, especially the latter, very dark but very beautiful guitar melodies, with the former having really arresting and surprising vocal choices on the chorus. Free Ride is faster and more fun, Road has some great intro guitar lines, but there are some tracks here that require a few listens to fully appreciate. First up we've got Horn, a very sparse and mysterious piece, full of emptiness. And no, a country blues song, compete with that classic off-key humming straight out of the Mississippi Delta. And finally, Harvest Breed, the only song on the album that comes close to being formulaic and just playing it too safe, thematically speaking. If you love Five Leaves Left and Pink Moon and are interested in exploring more, I personally would skip Brighter Later, his second album released in 1971, and instead start digging through the many posthumous compilation records. None of them are amazing altogether, but you can find some real gems, like Maybe I've Been Smoking Too Long, emotional and evocative, and an amazing cover of Jackson C. Frank's Milk and Honey. Most of the compilations also have a very raw, low-budget recording aesthetic that really adds something special.
Which will you hope for? Which can it be?
Pink Floyd, The Dark Side of the Moon, March 1973. Pink Floyd have managed to do what very few bands have, which is to deftly straddle the line between complex and artistic and commercially accessible, and they've been doing it well for a remarkable amount of time. A full cinematic experience from start to finish, the iconic album art, which is often held up as some of the best of all time, gives you a clear window into what you're about to experience. A 43-minute relaxing, spacey, trippy, quirky journey through space and time with 4 of the most talented musicians of their era. We begin with an experimental intro in the form of Speak to Me, which develops seamlessly into the second track, Breathe, with gentle electric guitar chords and judicious use of little pieces of synthesizer here and there, leading to some of the most relaxing vocals in the band's entire catalog.
Breathe in the air. Don't be afraid to care.
And then another avant-garde interlude in the form of On the Run. And then Time, a lyrical masterpiece which stands as a lot of people's favorite song on the album. To get to my favorite song on the album, however, we have to move a little farther forward past Great Gig in the Sky, which is a wonderful mixture of Richard Wright's skill at creating subtly beautiful piano arrangements and Claire Torrey's soulful cathartic vocals, and past the highly overrated Money, to eventually arrive at Us and Them, which is another slow-burning, relaxing, sleepy, spacey track anchored by different layers of keyboards and beautiful saxophone sections, which eventually give way to my favorite part, when the music finally drops and the tension is released. Brain Damage, a song often mistitled Dark Side of the Moon due to the fact that the album titles drop twice in the lyrics, is a great lyrical statement, followed by the aptly titled ending track Eclipse, although I personally think that the ending of the album would be just as impactful if the last two songs were switched.
And if your head explodes without proposed to, I'll see you on the dark side of the moon.
Led Zeppelin, Houses of the Holy, March 1973. This one doesn't have quite the same magic as the first four albums. I mean, Over the Hills and Far Away is a decent soft rock track, and it definitely has its fans, but I can take it or leave it. And at this point I can definitely appreciate the Crunge for what it was, which was actually a joke song, believe it or not, for those who still aren't up on the real deal with that song. And Dancing Days, I mean, okay, it's alright as something to put on in the background, but I think this record really starts to shine on the other side. Jamaica, by the way, that is actually how you're supposed to pronounce that, and yes, it made me mad too when I first found out, is a great, fun, upbeat reggae-inspired track that's super nostalgic for me, and The Ocean is great, straightforward rock that sounds great on The Song Remains the Same concert film. While writing this, I eventually came to the conclusion that No Quarter really is the best song on this record. It's 7 minutes long for those who haven't heard it. There are a lot of great live versions of this one as well, and it really has a lot of layers to it. That synthesizer sound, I mean, once you've heard it, there's no mistaking it. I think my favorite part is around 2 minutes and 15 seconds when the passionate urgency of that great vocal melody starts to mix with that very interesting bluesy riff.
Wearing steel that's bright and true. They carry skills that must get through. Nature's a path where no one goes.
And of course, the drums just keep coming. It's John Bonham. What else were you expecting? The weird, trippy sounds of the synthesizer also keep going as the song continues, with some interesting, relaxing, clean guitar lines that sound like something out of Planet Caravan. The Rain song has definitely gone way down on my list of favorite Zeppelin songs as I get older. There was a long time where it would have been top 5 for me, easy. But the lyrics mean a lot to me to this day, and I mean, I still do like the heavier part at least. Led Zeppelin, Physical Graffiti, February 1975. Now, this one is interesting. A lot of people put this as their second favorite Led Zeppelin album after 4. For some people, it's even their favorite above 4. For me, I'd probably put it at number 3. This is where things really started to develop and take a turn towards the more not experimental per se, in the sense of maybe being a little pretentious and obscure, but definitely still alternative, let's say. The Rover and Night Flight are really great standout tracks with very interesting musical features and unique lyrics. Two of the most underrated songs in their entire catalog and really worthwhile listening to many times. Kashmir, while I think it is a little overrated, I mean, still you gotta give them props. Those classic violins and trumpets. I mean, who would have thought of that 5 years prior? A lot of people, I'm guessing, would probably point to the trumpet sections or that opening that repeats over and over as being their favorite part. But for my money, it's gotta be that vocal melody at 3 minutes and 20 seconds, just before that menacing Arabian synthesizer melody starts to play.
All I see turns to brown as the sun burns the ground.
In My Time of Dying and Houses of the Holy are two great underrated songs, the first being a grim, despondent blues jam cover song, and the second being a fun, upbeat track about, well, honestly, I have no idea. Maybe I'm just dense, but it sort of seems like a successor to the themes of Misty Mountain Hop a tad, which I am all about for sure. And by the way, Houses of the Holy, the song, was originally recorded for the album Houses of the Holy, but they thought better of releasing it and saved it for the next release. Brony Hour, a great companion song to Brony Hour Stomp from Led Zeppelin 3, chill, classic, nostalgic, hard to tell which I prefer more between the two. You know, In the Light is pretty decent. It's got so many different, musical aspects and sections to it. I'd also give that sort of mid-tier ranking to Trampled Underfoot, Down by the Seaside, and 10 Years Gone. Even Custard Pie is fun to listen to occasionally, ironically, believe it or not. There's really just so much here to appreciate. I mean, this record is 82 minutes long. But as you might expect, there is still some crap here too. I'm talking really about all of side 4, with the exception of Night Flight. And this would really be their last hurrah. They would release 2 more official full-length releases during their active career, Present and In Through the Outdoor, and a posthumous album entitled Coda in 1982, which, since it was comprised exclusively of rejected tracks, is not always considered to be a official Led Zeppelin album, and for good reason. And out of these 3 later releases, the 2 official releases and the posthumous release, on their 7th album, we've got only Achilles' Last Stand, a great track that's sort of a successor to No Quarter from Houses of the Holy, and T for One, which has some cool old-school blues lines, and then the great song All of My Love on the subsequent and final record In Through the Outdoor. So we've only got 3 good songs out of 14 remaining in their catalog after Physical Graffiti. Harmonium, Si on avait besoin de 5e saison, April 1975. Okay, my first prog album on the list. I've never really been into prog. I've found it to just normally have too many musical features going on at once in a lot of the more popular prog artists, and to just have a vaguely sort of corny atmosphere. Maybe that's just the case with the big 70s bands that most people start their prog journey with, and I need to branch out and get into more modern prog, but with modern prog it conversely just seems like a situation where we've got fairly standard rock/metal instrumentation 75% of the time, with just random super fast shredding and weird time signatures the other 25%. without a lot of focus on creating good guitar melodies and riffs in general. Instead, just relying on the shock value, as it were, of the really fast, weird proggy parts that come out of nowhere. So I haven't really been a big prog fan, with the exception of The Court of the Crimson King, which, although I do love it now, I had only really ever listened to a few songs on it until very recently, and so I couldn't include it here. But on the other side, we've got this album. This is a Quebec folk prog project, a fully French language project, translates to If We Needed a Fifth Season. Also often simply shortened to Les Cinq Saisons, the 5 seasons, this is a very mellow, uplifting record, with an appealing mix of flutes, clarinets, percussion, and guitar, but with some really unique, smooth, jazzy vocals from our two vocalists that really take you by surprise. The jam session vibes on the first track, Ver, are interrupted for a bit by our second track, Dixie. That's a bit more energetic, but just as complex, and features a lot more focus on complex acoustic guitar work. The third track tends towards the melodramatic and can be a little irritating in that way, but the vocals are just still so good that I think it's at least worth not skipping. And the fourth track, just beautiful. These jazzy chords that are sung so skillfully, so many different aspects to unpack. The vast majority of the second half of this record, except for that short third track, is one long song, entitled Histoire sans parole, or translated Stories Without Words. As you can imagine, it's instrumental, and it can drag on a bit. But I mean, seemingly every instrument gets its time to shine. You've got gorgeous flute passages, guitar sections. It seems to delve further away from jazz and prog and more towards folk on this side, which you would think I would prefer the folky side, but I actually do prefer the first half of the album. It's just more focused, but the entire album is very good and worth checking out. Pink Floyd, Wish You Were Here, September 1975. Still fresh, unique, and interesting to this day, it's hard to think of a better follow-up to Dark Side of the Moon, one of the best and most influential albums of all time, than this groundbreaking space rock record that doesn't feel the slightest bit overblown or pretentious. Shine On You Crazy Diamond, officially Shine On You Crazy Diamond Parts 1 through 5, opens the album with some beautiful, soft, clean guitar lines and organ chords, and continues on with some really soulful yet deceptively simple bluesy guitar playing that seems as if it could come straight out of a George Harrison tune, and some great heartfelt vocals. Have a Cigar and especially Welcome to the Machine are still very politically relevant tracks, with great music to back them up, and while I think the title track is quite overrated, I could at least respect the great lyrics. The album ends with the second half of Shine On You Crazy Diamond, parts 6 through 9, which, while not as impactful as the first half, is still worth listening to. Joy Division, Unknown Pleasures, June 1979. If I had to pick just one release to show someone from the baby boomer generation just how diverse and interesting alternative rock can be, it would probably be this one. Some may know it as the T-shirt album. I know it as one of the most knock your socks off, haunting, intense records that there ever was, still to this day. There have been very few great baritone rock singers of history. Jim Morrison, Glenn Danzig, and, of course, the frontman of Joy Division, Ian Curtis. The passion and intensity of his singing, as well as just how much it fits with the music, makes you pretty much forget that he's technically singing out of tune a lot of the time. The bass really takes precedence, though, endlessly chugging forward with a tone so high I bet 90% of listeners mistake it for lead guitar. So far, I haven't really found any bands that put this much emphasis on the bass. I would probably say the best bass performance on the album is the fourth track, Insight. You'll also find some great slabs of more hard driving rock on songs like Interzone, and especially Shadowplay, where the yearning, haunting wail of the guitar really puts you in a dour mood in the best way. But the real standout track is New Dawn Fades, with that slowly creeping guitar line that comes in right after the opening bass part, being really just the embodiment of hopelessness, and one of the best songs ever made. Transmission and She's Lost Control are also highlights, with the latter showcasing one of Ian Curtis's most frantic, neurotic vocal performances. I highly recommend searching up a BBC performance of these last two songs.
God told me to skin you alive.
The Dead Kennedys. Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables, September 1980. I've just never really got punk. I can respect the enormous influence it had on the way metal changed and progressed through the decades, its influence on a lot of the indie rock that I enjoy, and I really admire the passion and dedication the fans have and how much time they dedicate to the subculture and the strong sense of identity they have, and I especially appreciate how much emphasis they put on supporting local bands, but the music itself has just always seemed too repetitive for me. The Dead Kennedys have always been an exception, mostly as a result of Jello Biafra's more melodic vocals, which are very well controlled and have some really hilarious moments. For those unaware, the Dead Kennedys were a hardcore punk band from San Francisco that put out a series of records from 1980 to 1986 that were mostly highly political in their lyrical content, aimed at corporations, politicians, generals, and celebrities, with a good deal of sarcastic fun tracks with little political content thrown in for good measure. This album is DK at their best, with solid, aggressive guitar playing from Raymond Pepperell, or East Bay Ray as they called him, and a fun-loving, vaguely rockabilly sensibility, suffusing the album from start to finish. And of course, those great vocals. Dick Gowan, A Handful of Earth, March 1981. Dick Gowan is a Scottish folk singer, still active today, with a very unique, sometimes gruff and low, sometimes extremely nasal vocal style, paired with a thick accent that can take some getting used to, but once you have, you're in for a treat. With beautiful, inspiring lyrics, an inventive guitar playing that runs the gamut from warm and comforting to haunting, without ever being depressing or melodramatic. The album's musical sources are nearly all old-school, traditional, unattributed ballads, starting off with a great rendition of Erin go Bragh, an old tune about the common plight of both Irish and Scots against English domination in a time when Irish immigration to Scotland was increasing manyfold, and continues on with Now Westland Winds, a gorgeous paean to the beauty of unspoiled nature and the shame of humankind's folly in trying to control it. And one of my favorite songs, penned by Robert Burns, the most famous author to come out of Scotland for those who are unaware. The next tune, Craigie Hill, really highlights his skill at that very traditional Gaelic style of singing, tinged with melismas and vaguely dissonant melodic flourishes. And World Turned Upside Down will touch the heart of any political radical with a soft spot for history. Just one of the most inspiring songs I've ever heard, about a 17th century group of English radicals from an agrarian background called the Diggers, that had a significant impact on socialist political thought in the coming centuries. The Snows They Melt the Soonest brings us back to more gentle stylings, with very slow, measured guitar picking, and vocals with no notes out of place that really lulls you into the rural landscape of its lyrics. Loch Earn, the sixth track, is another great vocal performance, and the eighth and ninth tracks are 20th century folk songs. One a slow and gentle patriotic Irish ballad called Song for Ireland that I first heard performed by the Dubliners, and the other another rousing revolutionary anthem. The closing track is one I first heard from Dick Gowan when he was backing up Emmylou Harris and is definitely underrated amongst his catalogue.
I'll forsake friends and relations and quit this Irish nation.
Iron Maiden, The Number of the Beast, March 1982. I discovered folk and black metal before I really got into classic metal, and it was Iron Maiden that finally convinced me it was a subgenre worth paying attention to. Aces High absolutely blew my socks off the first time I heard it, and from then on I got more into paying attention to the metal documentaries and the retrospectives of all the various bands from that era on VH1. Iron Maiden quickly became my favorite 80s metal band, and one of my favorite bands in general, but like The Doors and The Who, I listen to them less and less as I get older. Still, this is their best record. The Prisoner is an inspiring hymn of freedom, Run to the Hills is just a great composition overall. Vocal melody, the bass, the riffs, they really caught lightning in a bottle with that one. There's still very little like that song to this day, I think. The title track, Number of the Beast, is still a standout and a great headbanging anthem, and the opening spoken word style of delivery from Bruce Dickinson really illustrates just how good of a showman and an actor he is, apart from just being a singer. 22 Acacia Avenue is a fun story and really shows the band's dedication to continually coming up with new lyrical themes. I think only out of my favorite bands, Blind Guardian can hold a candle to Iron Maiden on this point. But the newer metal subgenre of power metal, of which Blind Guardian is a fundamental archetype, and we'll get into later, is great for sort of mining all sorts of literary, philosophical, historical, even scientific topics for song lyrics. Hallowed Be Thy Name is still my favorite song on the album. Just a great lyrical statement of a man condemned to die that doesn't feel overblown or too edgy still. So many different riffs. I really like the way they put together the section right after Bruce finishes the last line of the first verse. The lead guitar riffs and drums are great. If I had to pick a weak track, it would probably be Gangland. Just sounds a bit too much like the other songs on this record. Children of the Damned is a pretty cool ballad, but it does get to be a bit too corny and melodramatic after a while. No other Maiden record really comes close to the consistency of this one, but I definitely would respect you if you said that all of their first 5 albums are great. I mean, all of them have a few classics on them at least. I really have a spot for the Paul Di'Anno albums myself. They remind me of Deep Purple a bit. Sure, they've never really taken the world by storm with any of their albums after the 80s, but they've kept their style consistent right up until today, and that's something worth appreciating. And they all have great stage presence, and I'd love to see them live someday.
Beside yourself is Brady is gonna stay. Reason is
REM, Murmur, April 1983. This was one of the highest ranked albums on a list of greatest alternative rock albums of all time, which was the same list that introduced me to the Smiths and to Joy Division, and it really blew me away when I first heard it. At the time of their debut, REM were categorized under the label of jangle pop, a movement of light-hearted rock musicians trying to set a distinctive stance against the excessive use of synthesizers in mainstream 80s music. That became notable for their use of jangly, bright Rickenbacker guitars, explicitly betraying influence from the Byrds, with just a hint of psychedelia mixed in. The band lulls you into a false sense of security with a very short synth intro at the beginning, before launching headfirst into their first track, Radio Free Europe, a driving rock tune with a powerful bass line. Every song on this album is just so different from the others. The second track, Pilgrimages, got another odd melodic bass line, paired with some of the best vocals on this record. If I could sum up the sound of this record, it would be playful, cryptic, dreamlike, and definitely a bit stonery. It certainly helps that the snarl of kudzu vines on the cover look a lot like weed. Michael Stipe's lyrics are some of the most debated and argued over in all of rock music. They're quite cryptic and really serve more as a vessel for the voice rather than actually having any meaning. And the voice itself, nasally and off-key, and can take some getting used to, but it's time well spent to get used to it. You really feel the emotion and authenticity in his voice. Talk About the Passion is probably the most accessible song, with the best pop sensibilities, with that simple guitar line. Catapult, my favorite track, with the most consistent focused guitar work and great psychedelic harmonies. Moral Kiosk gives a bit more of the grittiness that Radio Free Europe had. This album is just damn near perfect. The only weak spot is 9-9, which I think was their attempt at doing something a bit more avant-garde with those janky time signatures and spoken word samples, but even that's not that bad. The Smiths, self-titled, February 1984. This band, you either love them, appreciating the unique sardonic lyrics and deceptively simple hypnotic guitar work, or you hate them and think they're monotonously depressing and pretentious. I love them. I would have no idea who I am without the Smiths. The day I first saw the music video for this charming band, that day should be a federal fucking holiday. For those of you who have been taking a permanent residence under one or several rocks, the Smiths were an English alternative rock band that had releases between 1984 and 1987, known for their fierce allegiance to the jangle pop movement we talked about earlier, and we can't really talk about them without illustrating just how important each member was to their unique sound. Johnny Marr, who reveled in bathing his listeners' ears in soft, warm, crackling, jangly, hypnotic melodies. Mike Joyce, a drummer equally competent in the louder and more aggressive tracks and subtler ones. And of course, Stephen Morrissey, a vocalist and lyricist who embodied a distinctive and consistent archetype of a sort of world-weary, melodramatic, petulant, gay British aristocrat, too burdened by the great task of contemplating his own navel and fretting over a lost love to just get up and have breakfast. It is mostly his aesthetic and distinctive way of looking at the world that informs the Smiths' music. Even the upbeat, bouncy tracks, like my favorite Smiths song, This Charming Man, are full of disillusionment. It's not every day you hear driving guitars over lyrics about not being able to pick out good clothes for a party and worrying you will never hit puberty. Some of the slower tracks threaten to be so despondent that they border on sleepy and emotionless, like the opening track, Reel Around the Fountain, or Suffer Little Children at the end. But then you've got tracks with so much energy, like the pounding pulse of Still Ill, the fantastic chorus on You've Got Everything Now, both great lyrical achievements, and the wonderful synergy of guitar melodies and wailing vocals on Hand and Glove. This first album of theirs is still my favorite and was a fitting sign of what was to come later.